What if we were to put Christianity on trial? Do the claims of Christianity stand up to questions like, has science killed God? Is faith only for the irrational or unreasonable? Why are so many Christians so unlike Christ? Can Christianity make sense of longing and suffering? We're going to be talking about those difficult questions and so much more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. I am Sarah Stone. I'm the Outreach Director for Young Adults at MDPC. I'm joined by Evan McClanahan. I actually didn't say his name in our last podcast somehow. I felt terrible. So let me say it twice in this one. Evan McClanahan is the Senior Pastor at First Lutheran in Midtown Houston. And we are joined today by a very special guest, Dr. Kenneth Samples. We're going to call him Ken for our purposes today. Philosopher and theologian Ken Samples has a great passion to help people understand the reasonableness and relevance of Christianity's truth claims. He is the senior research scholar at Reasons to Believe and the author of several books, including Classic Christian Thinkers, 7 Truths That Change the World, and God Among Sages. So welcome, Ken. We're so glad to have you here with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Good to see you. I've seen a couple of your shows and enjoyed it. So thank you.
Good.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
And for those of you maybe catching us for the first time, Theology on Air is born out of a ministry called Theology on Tap, which is here in Houston. Young adults come together over craft beer to discuss theology, philosophy, religion, faith, and culture. And then we started this podcast to be able to kind of dive even more deeply into some of those issues. And so that's what we're doing today with Ken. I'm really excited. If you are listening to us on a podcast platform, rate us, review us, subscribe. If you're listening on YouTube or watching and listening, subscribe there as well, so that you can see when we're doing more of this kind of fun stuff. But I think that's all of the logistics. So we can dive in. Ken, this is your first time being on the show. So maybe tell us just a little bit about you and your story of faith and what even got you interested. We're going to get into your new book in a little bit, but just give us a little bit of your background before we dive into all these hard questions.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Well, like all of us, my story is deeply connected to my parents. My mom and dad kind of grew up in a rural state of West Virginia. They held kind of an evangelical faith, but my father was a World War II soldier, combat soldier in Europe, and he was in Rome during the liberation. And I think visiting the Vatican had a big influence on him because in the mid-50s, my parents moved to Los Angeles, which was an extraordinary move from West Virginia to Los Angeles. And my dad decided, and my mother agreed, to convert to Roman Catholicism in the early 1960s. So I was baptized a Catholic when I was 4 years old. I remember going to catechism with my parents. So my Christian influence begins very early. I was baptized at St. Athanasius Parish. St. Athanasius, of course, is one of my great apologetic heroes, one of the great theologians in Christianity. In fact, on the church door, it related the question of Athanasius standing against the world, Athanasius contra mundum. Well, I kind of grew up in the Catholic faith, but I was not deeply committed, and my parents kind of went through some tough times, and we kind of stopped going to Mass regularly. But when I was in my teens, I was really searching. I wasn't sure what I was searching for. I felt restless. I felt like I was looking for meaning and purpose and significance, and I think even my friends and the people that I knew would say, Ken is really searching for something. And I decided that I would go back to church. So I began attending Mass at 7 in the morning. Then I'd go to school or I'd go to work. In fact, I attended church every day for 2 years.
Wow. And, every day, not just every Sunday.
Every single day. In fact, at 7 in the morning, there would only be a few ladies in there who were praying the rosary, and they would talk with me a little bit. But my family went through what I would call a catastrophe, Sarah and Evan. I had an older brother. His name was Frank. He was a great person, but he suffered mental health challenges. This was kind of during the hippie era. He became addicted to narcotics and then later was incarcerated. And my brother took his life when I was
Mm,
19 years old. He was only 27. And boy, that just fast tracked my searching.
of
I felt
course.
I felt terrible. I felt guilty that I couldn't help him, and that kind of led me to looking for spiritual answers. I thought about being a priest for a good bit of time, but there were two people that kind of persuaded me not to do that. One of them was my wife, who was then girlfriend Joan.
Oh.
She decided that it would be better that we had a different kind of life. But I also came across Walter Martin, who was the original Bible answer man.
Hmm.
And Walter's mind, his critical thinking, his knowledge of scripture just really had a deep influence on me. And so in my early 20s, I decided to embrace a Protestant evangelical faith. And, I would say, Sarah, I don't think I came to Christianity specifically because of an argument. I think that I came out of need. But
Hmm.
as soon as I came out of need, I think that apologetics became important because Jehovah's Witness would knock at the door and tell me that the Trinity was false and there was no hell. Or I'd go to school and study philosophy and I'd be told that, nobody intellectually believes in God anymore. So even though my first tendency toward God, I think, was out of need, immediately apologetics, reasoning, thinking became very important.
Yeah. Man, okay. And so you're not a Catholic priest. You're in school and you're having these kinds of conversations and becoming fascinated more and more with apologetics.
Yeah.
I'm curious. So we're going to be spending the bulk of our time today talking about your new book, Christianity Cross-Examined. So you guys can go buy that. It's coming out. When is it coming out actually? Because I
I,
have like the PDF.
I think it's scheduled for next week. We're hoping next week we'll have it from the printer and make it available.
Perfect. Okay. So by the time people are listening to this podcast, you can go and buy that Christianity Cross-Examined by Kenneth Samples. Um, and you've done this kind of thing for like almost 30 years now. So I'm curious, before we climb into all of the parts, like the different chapters that you talk about, what do you think in your conversations with people and in this milieu, what do you think are the kind of the top objections or obstacles to faith? I'm I'm asking you this partly because I do the same thing. And for me, I've realized that it almost always falls into one of three camps when I'm talking to people. Either it's the problem of suffering, it's the science issue, and that's, a broad term, or it's just and I say just, it's some kind of emotional hurdle, right? Like some wound or something that like, it's not a reason question. It's not something where they need a satisfying answer. It's that they just need love and prayer. And
Yeah.
what's it been for you? What do you think are kind of the big obstacles?
Well, those are the ones you mentioned. I think are very very important. Certainly, the perennial question. I think the perennial challenge to the truth of Christianity is the problem of evil, pain, and
Mm-hmm.
suffering. But I think there's kind of an emerging objection to God that is associated with the problem of evil, and that's what is known as the hiddenness of God.
Mm-hmm.
I see that as becoming kind of the one-two atheist critique of God, the problem of pain, suffering, and evil, and God's alleged hiddenness. I would, of course, add working at Reasons to Believe. I think many people have questions about science, evolution, the multiverse, whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is. There's always people who uh, maybe like me, they have kind of Christian roots, but they're kind of math science people, but they don't know how to navigate. I think Reasons to Believe helps a lot of people in that score. But I would add, Sarah, one more. I think lots of people have questions about how can Christianity be true in light of the world's religions? I mean,
Hmm.
just Christianity? What about Hinduism and Buddhism and Judaism and Islam? I find that people have lots of questions about Christianity's relationship to these other faiths.
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. Um, in your book, you actually break it down or you structure it in two parts. The first part is about, is Christianity rational? And the second part is it good? And of course, in the second part, you get into things like suffering. But in the first part, you're talking about like, is it even reasonable? You know, is it a crutch? That kind of thing. I'm curious why you structured it that way. You mentioned something in the book about the shift to postmodernism. So maybe talk a little bit about that, and then we'll climb into those questions.
Yes, when I first started doing apologetics kind of professionally, again, I worked at the Christian Research Institute with Walter Martin. And when I would go to the academy, to the university, and give talks, sometimes to staff, often to students, so in the late 80s, all the questions I would get were what I would call truth questions. Does God exist? Is Jesus the Son of God? Did he rise from the dead? They were always oriented toward truth questions. I noticed, however, about 15 years ago or so, that when I would go to the university as a representative of Reasons to Believe, I started getting different kinds of questions. I still got some truth questions, but people started asking, has Christianity really been a force for good in the world? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
has Christianity been good for racial minorities? What about women?
Mm-hmm.
Or what about all of the challenging issues relating to Christianity and suffering and things of that nature? I would, of course, argue that I think I moved from modernism, questions about truth, to postmodernism, where people had real questions about, if Christianity is true, maybe I won't want to believe in it anyway because I
Yep.
don't think it's a very good thing for the world. And I think I've seen that change. And so what I did in the new book is I structured it that way. The
He's a popular guy.
in the first part of the book, I deal with questions that relate to truth. And then in the second part, I raise those questions like, what about killing in the name of God? What
Mm-hmm.
about God commanding so called genocide against the Canaanites? And why is Christianity so divided? So I thought, I don't know that I've ever seen an apologetic book arranged that way. And I thought, well,
Yeah.
maybe I can do something that will be distinct.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that because I'm finding the same thing as I engage with people on sort of the edges of faith more and more as we, as time marches on, it's less about, is it true? Like, can you prove the resurrection? People are less concerned about that. And I have all my answers ready for it. But it's really, I remember somebody in my family saying, either God isn't real or he is real and he's a jerk that I don't want to follow anyway. And it was that second one that I thought, man, that's a whole different kind of apologetics that's required there. So if it's okay with you, we're just going to we're going to jump into as many of these questions as we can. And you can give us maybe like a little teaser answer, and then people can get the book to get the longer answer. Some of the questions that you ask in the book, we've tackled in some of our podcasts. So we'll skip those and make people listen to another episode. But did you want to, jump in?
Just real fast before we go any further, because I think I can maybe tie this in, but I don't know, for example, if you've read or know of Carl Trueman's new book, The Rise of the Modern Self, The Rise and the Triumph of the Modern Self. I've not read it. I've listened to some sort of in-depth reviews of it, and I intend to read it. But all this conversation reminds me of some of the same ideas, which is that there was a time when we were sort of all concerned with, discovering truth. But things have changed in the sense that we all think that we're like arbiters of truth, So it's not like we're all discovering the common truth of all people, but that we're discovering what is true for you. And I know this is kind of a trope for people who hate postmodernism to like make fun of Oprah for discovering your truth and all that kind of stuff. But is that kind of the change, that as a group, we used to sort of be like, as a society, we used to be committed to the idea of like discovering truth, but now it's more of an individual pursuit, and we all are the judge, of what's going on. And so we feel like we have the right to then question the goodness of something, or, the truth of something.
Yeah, I think so, Evan. I've often thought, I've read postmodernism years ago, but I thought it was largely just an academic area. But I think the last couple of years, maybe last year especially, I've recognized that ideas at the academy, they may seem extreme, they may seem narrow, but inevitably they kind of boil down and reach our front door. And I think in terms of postmodernism, yeah, I think that there has been a transition. I think in terms of the relativity of truth, the relativity of morality, that everybody has their own truth. I mean, there are people who talk about living in kind of a post-truth culture, maybe even the beginning of a post-Christian culture.
Oh, for sure.
I don't think we can afford to ignore postmodern thinking anymore. I think there are issues, and again, I've decided that when I hear ideas that I think are faulty, I'm not going to just assume that's just an academic idea that nobody will ever take seriously. I've decided to engage those ideas more now than ever before. I mean, we, in the ancient world and in the medieval world, Christians would talk about truth, goodness, and beauty. Today, I think that prism has largely been set aside. It's race, gender, and class.
Hmm.
And I don't like to get into political issues, but often political issues are grounded in philosophical ideas. So I do think we're up to our neck in postmodern thinking. I think it needs a critique. Of course, it needs a critique that's gracious toward people and critical toward ideas.
Kenneth, can you really quick just define when you say postmodernism, and we're alluding to it, but maybe give kind of a quick definition of what postmodern philosophy is?
Yeah, so if you think about ancient Christianity or medieval, you might call that pre-modern. The focus of reality is upon God. We find our meaning, purpose, and existence in God. Maybe from the time of the Enlightenment, there is a movement toward modernism where maybe we don't find meaning, truth, and purpose in God, in Scripture, but maybe we find it in nature, we find it in reason or in the human self. Postmodern then comes along and says, well, maybe there really is no objective meaning, purpose, and significance. Maybe when people appeal to those things, it's kind of a power play. So you may not have objective truth, you may have truth as you personally experience it. So again, we kind of see it as a prism. And I would characterize, Sarah, postmodernism as an extreme approach to relativity. There's no objective truth. Morality is purely subjective. And again, I read some of the postmodern philosophers when I was in college, and I thought, wow, I don't know, how many people really affirm it. I think our culture has been influenced by postmodern thinking.
Oh, for sure. And I think one thing I really like about your approach, as I've listened to you and as I've read some of what you've written, is my tendency is to, because I'm right on the edge generationally, but my tendency is to buck up and fight against this relativism and say, like, well, that's not true. If I have this cup and it's red and you say it's blue, you're still wrong, and kind of argue about that underlying ideology. Whereas it seems like you're saying, okay, we'll pause that for a second. Let's talk about the problem that you have and answer it and give as good an answer as you can to some of those objections, which is just the much more kind way to do it. I appreciate that. But okay, so in the first section, you talk a lot about science. You talk a lot about, is faith rational? So I want to kind of tackle a couple of those in as much as one can do in a podcast. So the first real big question that you ask in the book is about science. Hasn't scientific discovery made God unnecessary? Give us kind of a podcast level answer to that question. If someone came up to you and asked you and you had 2 minutes to answer them, how do you dispute that?
Yeah, I working here at RTB, we get to talk a lot about faith and science, and I appreciate kind of both the history and philosophy of science. And as I've read and thought about these issues, in the beginning of the 20th century, science was really moving forward. I mean, science is a remarkable discipline. Some people think the establishment of science is one of the greatest things human beings have achieved. But in the early part of the 20th century, there was kind of a movement toward secularism. Maybe we don't need theology to explain the universe. Maybe we don't need theology to explain human existence, the origin of life, the origin of consciousness. But Sarah, what I've seen is the more we approach those particular areas, when, at the beginning of the 20th century, many astronomers thought, well, maybe we'll discover a universe that's just eternal. That was what Aristotle believed. It was what Immanuel Kant thought was the case. Mm-hmm. But the more we've studied the nature of the universe, we bump into Big Bang cosmology.
Yeah.
And so Big Bang cosmology, which is challenged by ideas like the multiverse, and before that it was challenged by other views. But the more you reflect on Big Bang cosmology, the more God comes back into the picture.
That's right.
So if the universe had a beginning, then was there a cause? And I think in other areas, fine tuning in the universe, scientists talk about all of these factors that give rise to the human beings. It's kind of like you have all these dials and they're dialed in just right. And if it were a bit more or a bit less, life would not be possible. Well, again, did that fine tuning come by pure chance? Were we just lucky? Or did the universe have to be that way? But now scientists say, no, it is a remarkable thing that human beings have all the necessary characteristics to have life. So in that first chapter, I kind of go through a series of issues and say, the closer we look at these science issues, more and more, we don't discover what the atheists thought we would discover. We actually discover that God is a reasonable and plausible explanation for the phenomena we experience.
That was an amazing 2-minute answer first. Secondly, I'm kind of giggling to myself because I remember growing up I grew up in an evangelical household and community, and the Big Bang Theory was like the devil, right? Because it was about evolution and we believed in creation. I realize there's much more nuance to that conversation. We're not going to get into that today. But it turns out it's like the best thing that could have happened for apologetics, for the Big Bang Theory to be really widely accepted, because you're right, it's a beginning. And then you have the obvious question, well, who began it or what? And so it's kind of become a best friend to Christians that can say, like, look, something outside of this had to happen. You talked about in that first or second chapter, the intractable problem of consciousness. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, you have all of these kind of big origin questions. We talked just a bit about the origin of the universe. There's origin of life, the origin of humanity, and then there's the question of consciousness. How is it possible that human beings developed consciousness?
Mm-hmm.
Where we have self-awareness and we can think about things and we can do math and logic and have all of these intellectual qualities and characteristics. Sarah and Evan, what I think is this: what is more reasonable, to conclude that reason and mind and personhood came from a purely natural source that lacked all of those qualities? Or is it more reasonable to conclude that minds come from minds? Reason comes from a rational source. What's interesting, of course, in the field of both science and in philosophy, there have been many secularists who have proposed that, maybe the brain reached a level of complexity in its evolution and mind emerged.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe we can reduce things down and discover the naturalistic explanation for the mind. I think it's interesting, though, that even some very candid atheists are pessimistic about discovering a purely naturalistic explanation of consciousness. And again, I think a challenge. I've heard this idea for a long time, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I'm not sure I agree with that. But if that's the case, what could be more extraordinary than that reason came from the non-rational, that personhood came from the impersonal, that the mind came from the mindless? So again, I raise the question, isn't it reasonable and maybe more plausible to conclude that, again, God is the best explanation? And so, you have a number of secularists who have suggested that consciousness is so difficult to arrive at, you have to begin with it.
Hmm.
And so I think it's one more of those ideas that naturalists thought that they would discover a naturalistic explanation, but it's eluded them. And I
Yeah.
think the better explanation is God.
Interesting. And it's another one of those, it almost sounds like it's another one of those first cause
Yeah,
kind of things.
right.
Um, the second and last thing I want to talk about in the sort of science section of the book is you talked about you address the operating limits of science, of the sciences, and you listed these. I think there's 5 of them: logic and mathematical truths, metaphysical truths, ethical truths, aesthetic considerations, and the scientific venture itself. Maybe can you explain what you meant by the operating limits of science and those little categories you gave?
Yeah, what I find interesting, anytime I meet a new scientist through Reasons to Believe, and we have not only staff scholars who are scientists, but we often have visiting scholars come in, and I always ask them, why does science work?
Hmm.
Why does science work? And a lot of times they will say, I don't know, it just works. It's just kind of a remarkable thing. What I do in the book, Sarah and Evan, is I say, look, I think science, to have science, you have to have a science conducive world. You also have to have particular human beings that have qualities and characteristics, and there has to be a congruence of them. Let me simply say this. Um, Math and logic have to work in order to do science. Your cognitive faculties have to operate, your sensory organs have to operate properly. The world has to be ordered. Um, so you have to have all of these kind of factors kind of coming together. I don't think every worldview provides a science conducive world.
Hmm.
And think about, what if the universe is an accident and we are purely evolved by natural processes? It's amazing that we have all of these qualities in order to do science. I'm not sure science would have arisen in a Hindu worldview. I'm not sure
Interesting.
science would have arisen in a secularist worldview, but science did begin in the 1600s, and the worldview of Europe was Christian theism. Now, particularly to your question, what's interesting, of course, is that math and logic are not things that we get from science.
Mm-hmm.
Those are ideas that we begin with. They're starting points. We assume the truth of math and logic, and we use these tools to work through science. It's also true, though, that we have challenges in other areas. I mean, science does remarkable things, and scientists are people we should respect and admire. It's done a lot of good for the world, a lot of good for us. But science doesn't tell you about morality. It doesn't tell you what's good. I remember, my dad was a World War II soldier. They have developed atomic weapons at the time of World War II, but science could develop an atomic weapon, but it couldn't tell you whether we should use it. It couldn't tell you whether it was a right thing to drop atomic bombs on Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And in other areas, beauty seems to elude any kind of scientific evaluation. So there are very meaningful areas of life that can't be explained purely scientifically, but they're nevertheless real, true, and significant. So I think science is a great power, but it has limitations and boundaries. And if we understand that, then I think we can have a very vibrant view of science.
So why don't you think, can you give maybe one reason why science arose in a Christian context, but would not have in a secular or Hindu context? What is it about those contexts that don't provide the secret sauce for science to arise? And then I want to maybe tie some of our previous conversation together with this, or maybe it looks forward to the next conversation. But there was a Twitter movement, maybe I think it was last year, where 2 + 2 = 5. I don't know if you saw that, but even who's the guy that was at Arizona State, the astrophysicist that wrote the book A Universe from Nothing. Krauss, Lawrence Krauss.
Lawrence Krauss.
Oh,
Yeah.
that guy.
So he debated
boy.
like William Lane Craig wearing a shirt that said 2 + 2 = 5. So that's not
Yeah.
that's not a new thing, but it did reach kind of like a popular mass. And then just to throw out one more thing, there was that chart about white supremacy from the Smithsonian. And I know I'm getting a little controversial, but one of the sort of hallmarks of whiteness was sort of science and logic and reason and things like that. So I do think these things are starting to get bundled, where there is the question, there is a desire to kind of break apart traditional science in a way too. But maybe to the first thing, why don't you think science could have arisen out of a secular worldview or Hindu worldview?
Yeah, let's think first of all about Hinduism. I mean, the cosmology of Hinduism says that the universe may be a pure illusion. It also may be the God's body. It's hard to do experiments if you're, pulling needles into the body of God. Hinduism has this concept of Maya. Everything may be an illusion. I don't think that gives the kind of confidence and grounds the idea. I mean, to engage in science, you have to believe that there's a real world out there, that it's ordered, that human beings can track its intelligibility, that math and logic work, that our senses don't deceive us. They're not always reliable, but they're generally reliable. So I think that the Eastern mystical worldview, call it Hinduism, maybe even Buddhism, I think is very difficult to see how science would emerge. One Catholic thinker who was both a physicist, a man named Yaki, who was also a philosopher, he said that science was stillborn in all of the great civilizations, going back to China, going back to Babylon, going back, to the earliest part of civilization. His argument was things like reincarnation or a cyclical view of the universe. It doesn't have that kind of linear beginning, middle, end that is necessary to induction, to reason and rationality. Now, what about a secular worldview? Well, how do we know, what confidence do we have that there is order and rationality and patterns that carry through the entire universe? I mean, if the universe is merely the product of blind processes and accident, how do we know that we can trust all of these kinds of things? Now, what I would propose, Evan, is this. I think that not only historically did science begin in the context of a Christian worldview, but I think that Christianity provides all of the starting points that really support the idea. There's a real world out there. It reflects reason, rationality. Human beings are made in the image of God. They possess intellectual qualities that allow them to engage in it. Logic and math flow from the mind of God. The vast majority of the early scientists were Christian or Jewish. So maybe I can't argue that science wouldn't or couldn't, but I can argue that there's good reason that science began within a context of Christian theism.
I almost wonder if, when we were talking earlier about postmodernism, there's also an element, at least between Eastern and Western thinking, religious thinking, of orthodoxy versus orthopraxy. This idea that we're so concerned about what's true. What's the truth? Find the truth, epistemology. And orthopraxy is leaning a little bit differently. It's about what's the right thing, what is our duty, what's the right practice. And I wonder if that fits into it as well.
I think so. What I think is provocative about that, Sarah, is when you look at the three major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, even within those three, there are times that Islam agrees more with Judaism than Judaism agrees with Christianity. For example, if you're a Jew or a Muslim, you would ask questions of orthopraxy. You would say, do you keep kosher? Do you avoid milk and meat together in an Islamic context? Whereas Christianity has always been a very theologically oriented view. You don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to keep the dietary laws. Christianity has always had this idea of truth. And I think that has really kind of pushed Christianity ahead. In my view, Islam was more dynamic in its support of science in its earlier years. I think Islam over the centuries has moved more toward law. And I think in that ways, I think theology is a really good thing. So your show is, I think, a very good thing for people. We need to talk about theology.
Yeah, I agree. And if you're listening and you agree, feel free to throw a lot of money our way. No. And also, the Reasons to Believe is another great podcast to listen to. And you can even pick through the sciencey ones and the theological ones. It's great. You can learn about DNA, or you can learn about original sin, just depending on the day.
Yep.
So I'm moving us along because we're going to try to tackle your entire book in 1 hour. The next chapter that I found, something that I think our listeners would want to hear the answer to is faith incompatible with reason? The way that I've heard this question asked is, isn't it just a crutch? Is faith just a crutch? Which, of course, my answer is usually, yeah, it's a crutch. I need a crutch. But beyond my sort of snarky, yes, I need a crutch. How do you answer that question? Is it incompatible with reason?
Yeah, in my book, I kind of tackle it by talking about how faith and reason within a Christian context are compatible. For example, I think if you go back through the history of Christianity, I think a definition of faith emerges. We see it in St. Augustine. We see it in Anselm. We see it in Thomas Aquinas. We see it in Protestant thinkers, Orthodox thinkers. And it's simply this, that faith is confident trust in a reliable source. The root word is trust. So the Greek word that backs up faith is trust, but it's not just trust in anything. It's trust in a confident, reliable source. So I can trust my parents. I can trust this chair I'm sitting in is going to hold me up. Confident trust in a reliable source, which I would say the very definition of historic Christianity's concept of faith involves reason. It's a reliable, trustworthy source, not just any source. I go on to add certain things to that. In Christianity, faith always involves knowledge. To have Christian faith, you have to know something about Jesus Christ, who he was, what he did, his life, his death, his resurrection. So faith is, I think, compatible with reason and involves knowledge. Moreover, I think that God provides a solid ground for reason and rationality. Again, where did reason come from? Smart people, thoughtful people, reflective people, they always appeal to this tool chest whenever they have struggling issues. And that tool chest is made up of things like the laws of logic, mathematics, scientific principles. Well, if we all appeal to that common tool chest, where did that tool chest come from? How do you ground math, logic, and reason? Again, I think if God exists and he is infinite and eternal and has an infinite mind, knows all things, is rational, that would serve as a ground or reason. And I teach logic at Biola University. I've used a particular book, A Concise Introduction to Logic by Patrick Hurley, and he has a list of 10 eminent logicians in the book. 6 of them are Christian or have association with Christianity. It seems to me that Christians have always been interested in reason and logic because God is a God of reason and logic. Now don't get me wrong, there's always been a level of anti-intellectualism within Christianity, but I think some of the greatest thinkers, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Anselm, Luther, Calvin, today, people like Alvin Plantinga, it's extraordinary that Christianity has produced these kinds of thinkers who take reason and rationality so seriously.
It's interesting. What you just did is we think of faith and reason as being opposites, and you kind of turned that on its head and said, no, faith requires reason, which is I mean, I love it. I'm moving us along quickly because I want to get to the second half of the book, which is where I think most people have their questions. But the last thing I want to talk about in this section is you put a chapter in there that I thought, do people still ask this question? Maybe they do. If God created everything, then who created God? I mean, we already talked a little bit about this idea of if the universe had a beginning, then there had to be an eternally existent being to poof that into existence. That's my scientific vocab there coming through. But are people still asking this question, who created God? And then what's your answer to that?
Yeah, what's interesting, Sarah, is in 2017, the most Googled question about God was who created God?
Huh.
So a lot of people are still asking the question. And of course, Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins, Dan Dennett, all of the new atheists, they asked that question. Well, if God created the world, who created God? I think there are scientific answers, philosophical and theological. I'll sum it up by this. It seems the best explanation of our universe is that it had a singular beginning from nothing. That is, the universe seems to be a contingent reality, a dependent reality, and therefore needs a cause. You know, the idea that Lawrence Krauss has proposed that the
I was
universe...
just going to bring this up about something from nothing. It's so silly.
Yeah.
Continue. Sorry.
I mean, I would say so. No matter, no energy, no space, no time, no potential, no reason, no rationality. I think it's still absurd to argue that something could come from absolute nothing. Now, again, we could look at the question philosophically, and again, I would propose that if anything exists, then either something's eternal or something that's not eternal emerged from nothing. Atheists often say maybe we have a universe that is eternal, and so it is just a brute reality. Well, I think Big Bang cosmology reasons against that. And I would argue from a theological point of view that God is not the kind of being you could create. God is an infinite, eternal being. He has no beginning and no end. So I think we're back to that question again. What is the best explanation for the world we encounter? I think Christians have good answers for that.
The fact that people Google that tells me that people think that Google is God.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
It's like, why wouldn't you ask God who created him, you know? But anyway.
Well, and of course, Google says that they're going to solve death. I might stick with Yahoo, but if they solve death,
that'll be the thing that brings you over.
Yeah. Are they into the brain implants and living in the cloud after death and all that? Is that what
singularity?
Yeah, right, sure.
And we've done shows about transhumanism and such, so
great.
We're well versed on that.
Well, and I have both my COVID shots, so I'm basically, an AI now.
Yeah, so. You got that Luciferianism.
Oh God,
light something.
We'll
in
discuss
there. Anyway,
that on a later podcast. But let's go into part 2 of the book, because part 2 is more of this idea about if God, say all of the first part we say yes to, but is he good? And how do all the hard questions get answered really about, violence or all the isms, racism, sexism, those kind of things. And then of course, suffering. Some of these I'm going to punt to we just had Paul Copan on the show talking about Leviticus, and he gave us a great kind of survey of, did God sanction slavery? So I'm probably going to kind of push away from some of those questions. But the first one you have in there is, what about killing in the name of God? And then, you talk a little bit in there about Christianity has changed the world for good. So maybe we can tackle those to begin with. What about killing in the name of God? And then what's Christianity done that we can point to as Christians and say, but look.
Yeah, those are, I think, very, very important questions, because they're on the minds of so many people these days. And of course, the question of what about violence in the history of Christianity? I mean, you have the Crusades, you have the Inquisition, you have the Salem witch trials, you have the 30 Years' War. I look at all of those, and what I have discovered, Sarah and Evan, is this, that there is a significant exaggeration of Christianity's darkest episodes. That is, we're often told by critics of Christianity that the Crusades were just absolutely terrible. That you have Europeans who are bloodthirsty. They attacked particularly Muslims who were peace-loving, and it was just, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people were killed. What's interesting is that you have historians who are revising those ideas. And in actuality, historians argue that without the Crusades, Islam may have dominated and controlled all of Europe. Some would argue, and I would be one of them, that the Crusades were actually just wars. It was not about gaining money. It was not about gaining land. It was about defending Christendom. It was about defending European civilization. Let's look at the Inquisition, which of course many people think is, wow, I mean, you just have Christians torturing people, Catholics torturing Protestants, Catholics torturing Jews. What's interesting is, again, a reevaluation has come up that says that the judicial process, due process, when it comes to the Inquisition, had a superior view of justice than European civilization itself. So actually, in the Inquisition, it was more about it was more about repentance and forgiveness than it was about torture. Salem witch trials, atheists will sometimes say, who knows how many people were killed? Well, we know exactly 19 were executed. So there is this kind of consistent exaggeration of the dark side of Christianity. Now, I would also add this. I think there's a significant minimization of atheistic oriented evil. I mean, I'm a student of World War II simply because my dad was a soldier. When I look at the 20th century, I mean, if you look at the number of people killed in communism, and remember that communism affirms the idea, it's dialectical materialism. Atheism was an accepted principle of communism. Now, you could argue that Stalin and Pol Pot and all of these communists, they were misrepresenting atheism. But there are historians who stand by the idea that communism murdered 100 million people in the 20th century. So when Dawkins says Christianity has murdered people, I think the number of people killed in Christian-oriented wars is minimal compared to what we find in secularism. I think we could also add this. I think there's a lot of good that Christianity has done. Education and literature. I mean, we talked a little bit about the emergence of science in the 1600s. The firepower, the intellectual firepower that gave root to that were these universities that were started in Europe. Cambridge, Oxford, the University of Paris. These universities came into being in the Middle Ages. I was taught in the Middle Ages, it was just dark. Actually, there was a lot of light in the Middle Ages. Christians copied manuscripts, monks kept education growing. We can talk about social movements. I mean, there's a lot of discussion these days about slavery, about race relations. But if you look at both the United Kingdom, if you look at England and America, people who led the way in abolishing slavery were by and large Christians. Wilberforce, various other people. Law and government. I mean, the idea that individuals have rights, that people have benefits given by God, and then charity and philanthropy. I mean, you can look at when I was a kid, I noticed there were all these trucks that drove through the neighborhood. St. Vincent de Paul. The idea of Salvation Army. These all have Christian roots. The idea that people are made in the image of God means they have dignity and value. Doesn't matter if they're Christian, doesn't matter if they're male, female, slave, free, rich or poor. Christianity developed the idea that everybody has dignity and everybody who is in need should be provided for. So I think not only is Christianity rational, I think it's been a very good thing for the world by and large. Now, that doesn't rule out that there were bad things that were done, and I'm willing to accept that. But by and large, I think the good has far outweighed the bad.
Well, and I listened to a podcast that you recorded recently about sin, and you referenced Hugh Ross talking about something about Christianity is the best explanation of me, my best and my worst. Like the dignity that I have because I'm made in God's image, but also the capacity I have for great sin. So I just want to make sure our listeners know that even because we're getting some comments on Facebook, like, so what's he doing here? Just saying, well, atheists did it worse. I mean, I think the acknowledgement already on the table is humans are capable of such wickedness, both Christians and atheists and everything in between, but that maybe there has been exaggeration on the side of like so much killing in the name of Christianity, where maybe we need to shine the light a little bit differently just historically. But I know you had a question.
Well, it's a loaded question.
That's how Evan likes to do things.
Yeah, but I'm wondering if you would agree, because let's say that at the worst, some of the Crusades ended up with, say, Christians, sort of pillaging from other Christians. At their best, it was a just war against an unholy force in the world or something. But let's just say at its worst, those Christians, if they were doing so in the name of Christianity, were acting against the teachings of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
But it could be argued that much of what went on within communism, and given its moral foundations or lack thereof, was consistent with communism. So I mean, I hate to make it sound like a rigged game on my end, but I would, there's a way to judge the Christian actions, right? Whereas on communism, I mean,
it's what you would expect.
Yeah, it's kind of what you would expect if it played out.
So what's the question there? Do you agree with that?
Do you agree with my assessment?
I think it is a reasonable assessment. I mean, I'm glad that most atheists I know condemn what Stalin did, what the Chinese Revolution did. But I think your point is a provocative one. I mean, Christians who have done evil things, they've gone against the teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. They have violated the Imago Dei. Human beings are made in the image of God. Thou shalt not murder is one of the commandments. But if we are the product of blind mechanistic natural processes and there is no mind or God behind the universe, then I think it's much harder to say that there is an objective basis against killing one another. I mean, why couldn't a communist say, by any means necessary, we must put down the capitalist system. There are the oppressors and the oppressed, and if it means killing to bring it about, it may be the greater good. Again, I don't want to say that atheists are worse people than Christians. I like what Pascal said. All of us are great and wretched, great in the image of God. We can do math, we can do science, we have language, all of these things. But we're wretched. I mean, I don't think you need the devil to explain Auschwitz. I think human beings all by themselves, humans are wretched. And again, though, I think Christianity has an explanation. We're fallen. Hugh Ross once said to me that he thought if evolution was true, humans are both better and worse than evolution would produce.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
that was what the quote was. Yeah.
And I think in terms of the other religions of the world, Islam does not believe in original sin. They don't believe in a catastrophic fall. And that puzzles me because Islam has had so much violence within its history. So who best explains the human condition? I think the biblical position of human beings is actually quite plausible.
I have to jump in here because we have very little time left and we have two big questions left on the table. So I'm going to move us forward. And if you want to hear more or read more, you got to get the book. The two last things I want to tackle are hypocritical Christians and then the problem of suffering. So we're just going to wind up the problem of suffering in like 2 minutes. It'll be great. But first, you spend some time in the book talking about why are Christians so unlike Christ? And then you also talk about the fracturing of denominations. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit, but I'm more concerned with, I hear this all the time, that one of the problems or one of the obstacles to people saying yes to Christianity is Christians, because we can be kind of jerks, or inconsistent. So maybe talk a little bit about why Christians are so unlike Christ, and then we'll jump to the biggest question of all, probably.
Yeah, I remember Houston Smith, a leading world religion scholar. He said, when you look at the life of Jesus, he not only taught the Sermon on the Mount or preached the Sermon on the Mount, it appears he lived the values of the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, I think all human beings, we struggle with anger, envy, gluttony, lust, pride, and sloth. It seems to be the human condition. Um, I think that hypocrisy is always unacceptable. But in terms of the Christian worldview, human beings are made in the image of God, but they're fallen. Every day I begin with a prayer. Lord, I struggle with impatience. I struggle with eating too much. I struggle with lust. I struggle with this or that. Christians recognize that all of us are hypocrites with what I would call a lowercase h.
Mm-hmm.
None of us are perfect. Sanctification is never completed in this life, with all due respect to some who say it is. But there is then hypocrisy with a capital H, people who live double lives. One author said that maybe all of us have three lives. We have a public life, a private life, and a secret life. Some people who are hypocrites with a capital H, they have a secret life where, they commit all of the sins that they condemn. I think the reality is, if you get to know me, pretty quickly you'll realize that I'm a sinner. Real quickly you'll realize that I'm far from perfect. Christians may disappoint you, but I got a promise: Jesus won't. And that's why we need a savior. We don't need even a prophet. We don't need a psychologist. We need a savior. We're fallen people. In terms of the divisions within Christendom, I like to think of myself as a peacemaker. I like to think of myself as ecumenical. Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox have some very serious doctrinal issues, but we share a lot in common. I mean, look at the Nicene Creed. That's a big slice of Christianity, and all three branches affirm it. We share values. We believe God created all people in his image. We believe in the same worldview: creation, fall, redemption, consummation. Nevertheless, Christians at times, we lack grace. I mean, one thing that bothers me about myself is I talk about grace constantly, and there are times where I'm not very gracious. Again, tying that back to my need for a savior. But I like to say that I contend for the truth, I promote unity, and I strive toward charity. I respect Catholic thinkers. I respect Orthodox thinkers. I respect my Baptist friends, my Lutheran friends. And I think we all need to strive to fulfill Jesus's prayer in John 17, that his church will be one the way the Son and the Father are one.
I saw a billboard one time that said, "The church isn't full of hypocrites. There's always room for more." No, I love that. And we've got some people commenting on Facebook that they appreciate you acknowledging your own weakness. I think the more Christians can do that, the more we can kind of pave the way, just with some basic humility.
I will say quickly, I hope that hypocrisy remains a problem, because one of my concerns is that nobody seems to care anymore. Politicians, they say one thing and do something else and nobody cares. So I worry that actually hypocrisy is becoming kind of status quo. Nobody really pays it any attention. It's like the rich person who tells us all how to live, but they don't live that way, or the environmentalist who tells us all how to live, but they don't live that way. It's like there's no pushback on that.
Well, and if we have a problem with that, then it shows that we have some sort of moral standard.
Yeah.
Which is a great thing for apologetics. Okay, so the hardest question we're going to tackle, we've saved it to the end. You spend a lot of time in the book talking about, and I think it's interesting you put these two terms together. You said the chapter title is, "Can Christianity make sense of longing and suffering?" I've just talked about suffering and evil and wickedness. I don't often put the word longing with it. So maybe you can explain why you did that. And then, in as much as somebody can sum up that answer in just a couple minutes, what is your answer to that?
Yeah, I relate to this very much. Again, one of my favorite Christian thinkers is St. Augustine, and Augustine talks about his restless life, that he was looking for purpose, meaning, and significance. And, his great career as a rhetorician didn't fulfill it. He engaged in, he had various sexual relationships that didn't fulfill him. He looked in philosophy, he didn't find it fulfilling. Sarah and Evan, I can relate to this. I mean, there are times where I long for things. I long to survive physical death. I long for love and purpose and meaning. I realize there's limitation and pain in life. C.S. Lewis developed an argument he got really from Augustine and Pascal. And it's the idea that we have certain longings. We long to survive the death of our body. We long to have ultimate fulfillment and love. He then proposed that maybe we're longing, we can't get it here because it belongs to another world. And again, I would propose the idea that Christianity has an explanation for that. We're made by God for God, and drugs won't suffice. Hedonism won't suffice. Pleasure, money, none of it will fulfill us. And of course, the biblical answer, the Christian answer is because we were made for God. We were made to have a relationship with God. It's gone terribly wrong with the fall, but then Jesus came into the world, the Son of God, the second member of the Trinity, took human flesh and came into time and space, laid down his life for us to reconcile us to God. I still long. I still have a soul that longs for God, to live with God, to love God. And some people would say it's wishful thinking, it's fiction, but I actually think it says something about the human condition. And I think the Christian answer is, again, plausible.
So I think that idea of longing and the answer, the Lewisian, which I guess is maybe Augustinian or comes from Pascal, but that idea, it's a satisfying idea. But when I think about suffering that happens, I think most people can get behind this idea that a lot of the suffering that happens in the world is because people are evil or people are bent toward rebellion or bent toward sin. We can get behind that. We can look at Hitler and say, well, he was a bad guy that gave himself over to his, baser instincts. But when you look at things like children being sex trafficked or bone cancer, that's like one that comes up a lot with atheists that will talk about, well, how do you justify that? Or why wouldn't God do something about that? That's not, that child didn't do something wrong to deserve that. What's your answer to those really tough gotcha kind of questions? I mean, I struggle with that.
Those are hugely challenging questions. I remember when I drove home from church, I would drive by Children's Hospital of Orange County. And I knew there were kids up there who had cancer. They were just small little babies and they were suffering. And I would cry out and say, Lord, what's the purpose here? Well, we live in a fallen creation. And one of the things that encourages me is that God says that when Christ returns, he'll take all the crooked straws and make them straight. That is, a child may die of cancer here, but then they enter into eternity with God. I think some of the suffering here needs to be understood in the context of what lies ahead. I also would say that there's a lot of good that comes out of difficulty and suffering. Maybe God is working through those. I mean, the worst crime in history was the crucifixion of the sinless Son of God, but out of it came redemption for all who believe. Sarah and Evan, I like vacations, I like entertainment, I like having fun, but I've never learned something deeply profound from that. It's always the difficulties. It's always the trials of life that end up being the profound teacher. I think God intended it that way. So sometimes we can't look up until we're flat on our back.
I know we could talk so much more about that. Again, get the book and read the book. And we will continue having these sorts of conversations weekly on Theology on Air. But just as a last kind of, if someone's listening to this and maybe even they read your book and they think, but I haven't been doing apologetics for 30 years, maybe what are a couple of suggestions about how people could just start to engage in these conversations if they don't have, all of the theories of A and B time ready to talk about cosmology or whatever? Like, how do you kind of just start these conversations with your neighbor or your coworker who's not a believer? Any kind of quick tips for starting those?
I want to say that I like it that you're a nerd. That is great.
Well, you're one of like 3 people. Yeah.
What I would say is I try to practice what I call the golden rule of apologetics. And that is, I try to treat other people the way I want my ideas treated. That doesn't mean I accept other people's ideas, but it means I try to get them right. I try to handle them in a fair-minded way. And I also try to build bridges with people. We're human beings. All people are made in the image of God. All people are the recipients of general revelation. All of us experience God's common grace, the rain and the sunshine that falls on all people. I try to get other people's ideas right. I try to build bridges with people. I think Christians can learn from non-Christians, just as we think non-Christians can learn from us. I would also invite Christians to be truth seekers. I'm a truth seeker first and a Christian apologist second, meaning that I believe there really is truth that all of us can know. And so I think things like charity, I think things like respect and humility play a very important role in talking to other people about our faith.
Yeah, I've appreciated that about you today. And so I know that goes a long way in just the kind of conversations we have in life. If people want to find you and maybe send you an email or ask you follow-up questions, where can people find you, Ken?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I work at Reasons to Believe. We have a website called reasons.org. There is a place where you can leave a note, ask questions, and it will come to me. So yeah, reasons.org.
And in my experience with Reasons to Believe, they get back to you fast. Like you would think a big organization like that, it would take a minute. But anyway, I've been impressed. And for Theology on Air and Theology on Tap, everything you need to know in this life, no, I'm kidding, but about us at least, can be found at houstontot.com. You can go check us out there. And like I said earlier, whatever podcast platform you use, rate us, review us, subscribe. The more we grow, the more things we can do. So, but thank you so much, Ken, for joining us today. I hope to have you back sometime. This has been wonderful. But until we see you or any of our listeners again, we encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.